and welcome here to Eden Mennonite Church as we worship together as a gathering of God's people. Welcome to those here in the sanctuary, those that are joining by Zoom, and those who will watch later. God welcomes us all to worship today and promises to be with us. Psalm 24 begins with these words, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it. For he founded it on the seas and established it on the waters." What a generous God we have, who has given us this amazing world and has invited us to participate in it. God is the host, and we are the guests. This introduces to us the start of our 5-week series on hospitality. Thanks to the Visual Committee for providing this visual display as we explore what biblical hospitality looks like. As part of this series, we are inviting the congregation to memorize a portion of Scripture. So if you look on the back of your bulletins, there's a passage here from Romans 12 that we encourage you to memorize during the next few weeks. So I invite you to read with me that first verse that is in bold, verse 13. "Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality." So you can keep working on that this week as you go home and even go farther if you want, but we'll take a verse or two each week, and hopefully by the end we will be living into what it means to practice hospitality.
Thank you to the choir, and I hope we can either verbally or silently give a hearty amen to the concept of wanting to be more like Jesus. One of my current favorite Bible teachers often says that if we want to learn about a particular topic or idea in the Bible, we should always go to page 1. And so for the next several weeks, we're going to focus on the concept of hospitality, and I thought maybe we would start at page 1. So if you noticed, we were on, in most of your Bibles, page 1 or maybe 2, the Genesis account of creation. For full disclosure, Diane and I, as we were discerning sort of what is next in the life of the congregation as this time leading up to the church season of Advent and Christmas, we felt like that hospitality might be an important topic or area to focus on as we just get the sense, as many of us do, that there's increased anxiety, increased tension, increased division in the world at large. And we hope that spending some time being formed by the biblical vision of hospitality could be a step forward for all of us to more faithful living in the midst of a time when we feel so much division between peoples. So that's what was going on as we've been preparing. As we get into this, what I would hope that we recognize and try our best to do is sort of set aside this vision that we have, or this understanding that we have of even the term and practice of hospitality, because typically when we think of hospitality, we might think of like, the 10-minute scramble to clean up the house before guests come over, and making sure that we have the nice dinnerware out, and we make sure to offer tea and coffee and that sort of thing. Hospitality in the Bible is a lot deeper and a lot richer and a lot broader than having a nice meal or the hospitality industry of hotels and motels and that sort of thing. Hopefully, if we continue to go deep into this biblical concept of hospitality, we will see how it affects our everyday lives and how I think it can change the world and be something much deeper and much richer than just simply having people over for lunch, although that's included in hospitality. So as we begin on page 1 with the concept of hospitality, we notice right off the bat that God is presented as the host. God creates everything. God creates the heavens and the earth and fills them with plants and animals. The obvious truth that we learn is that God is the creator of everything, and after God creates, God gives. So they create human beings in their image, and they give humans plants and fruit for food. That's how God operates. And in this opening vision of the relationship between God and creation and humanity, God is the creator, God is the host, God brings the human beings into and out of the earth, God's home that God has created. Humanity has been welcomed into this world. Everything else has already been created, and humanity is brought into it. And then welcomed as honored guests, as blessed guests, as given really important role in taking care of and being the stewards of the house, given a purpose, given a place to live. So this might be obvious, but does it affect us on a daily basis? How does it change our lives if we remember that we are honored guests with responsibility to care for the host's home? So if we conceive of ourselves as Airbnb guests, does that change the way we interact with the world around us? Being in someone else's house, being in someone else's home, I think makes a difference in how we live in it. I think I've even noticed that in the difference between going to hotels and using Airbnb. Because hotel rooms have always felt like this big industrious thing that have paid cleaning staff. And so there's a little bit less responsibility maybe to keep the hotel room nice and clean. But I've noticed since we started using Airbnb more often that we're in someone else's house a lot of the time. Some of the places are rental places, but sometimes in New York City, you can't actually have a rental Airbnb. It has to be a residence that you also live in. So we're in someone's basement, we're in someone's house. And it makes a difference in how we take care of it because we recognize that it is someone else's house. And we know that the hosts can give us ratings. They can rate the guests. So it makes us a lot more aware of how we're taking care of things. When we were in Texas, I took a group of perfectly responsible youth who always clean up after themselves. And for the whole week, I was like, okay, this is on our family Airbnb account, and if we use this in the future, what does that mean for our ratings? So I was very aware of how the youth were taking care of the place. And of course, what ended up happening was that I, needing to sleep on the pull-out couch and recognizing that the giant bar was just not going to be suitable for me to sleep in, pulled the mattress out and just laid it out on the living room floor, thinking, I'll put everything back just fine. And on the second or third day, we came back for our afternoon siesta, and I recognized that I had left the air conditioning on all day, which the host had said not to do, and the pipes froze up, and water started leaking down, and I had essentially a swimming pool on the hardwood living room floor that had soaked into the mattress that I had pulled out. So I frantically scrambled all the towels in the Airbnb, and I put the mattress outside to air out for the entire day, and the mattress pad and everything. And I had to immediately text the host to say, I think we have an issue. Thankfully, the host was very gracious and worked with me and sent someone over to fix the AC. But of course, in all my concern over what these high school kids might do to this Airbnb place, it was my own stupidity that potentially got me in trouble. I haven't checked our guest rating at this point. Sorry, Becky, if we end up with a really bad one, it is my fault. But it makes a difference when you're in someone else's house, when you could potentially have ratings as a guest. How would your Earthbnb rating be? How would God rate you as a guest of Earthbnb? I would hope that as we have that in our minds, that at the very least, that our decisions about daily life would be affected in some way. That we would at least take the time to consider the materials and the chemicals that we use, the waste that we create, what we eat and how we eat. In other words, all the things in daily life that potentially have an impact on God's home. I would hope that at the very least the recognition that this is God's home and we are guests is taken into that account, that we consider those impacts in the place that we are living. If we're only making those kinds of daily decisions based on cost or convenience, or because that's just the way the world is, then we've lost the foundational concept from page 1 of this relationship between God and creation and humanity. How are our daily lives different when we remember that we are God's guests in this good world? As we move then through the Old Testament, we see reminders of this coming up, that the earth belongs to God alone. So when Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 15 are called to be the parents of God's people, this people that God is going to call into a special relationship, that they are sent to a land that God would show them and give them. The language is subtle, but the reminder when God is talking to Abraham and Sarah in Genesis 15 is that the land is God's for the giving, not ours for the taking, or not theirs for the taking. So we heard from Diane this morning in the opening Psalm 24 declaring, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all who live in it." Again, as we move along, this concept is reinforced and expanded by the shocking practice of the year of Jubilee, one that some of us might be familiar with and some of us might not be. So once the people had gone into the land that God had given them, they made it into the land of Canaan. What happened was God sort of subdivided the land among the 12 tribes. So each of the 12 tribes were given sort of a parcel of land. And as time went on, that parcel of land was theirs to steward and take care of. But because of certain successes or certain economic failures or whatever happened sort of over the course of time, some pieces of that land were bought and sold between the tribes. Some tribes were able to accumulate some more land because they had been more successful. Some had to sell off land to have the resources they need. Some people were bought into servitude or slavery. And so we see in Leviticus 25 that God actually sort of sets a reset button. Every 50 years is the year of Jubilee. And in the year of Jubilee, every 50 years, some really shocking things happen. All debt that is outstanding is completely erased. All people who, for economic reasons, had sort of sold themselves into servitude were freed from that service. And, interestingly, all land that had been bought and sold between the tribes was completely reverted back to the original 12 tribe parcels. Now, on one hand, I think the reason this was done was to maintain some level of equity, some level of equality, that the tribes that were maybe less successful in some way did not continue to have to sell off land, continue into poverty, and those that were successful and were maybe wise and shrewd business people didn't just keep accumulating land upon land that was part of their siblings' tribes' inheritance, essentially. It was a way of keeping the tribes of Israel equal so that they would not continue along this road of sort of economic division. Now that's one reason for it. I think the other reason for it is to remind the people ultimately that this land is not theirs to buy and sell forever. This land belongs to God. So if you know as well that this land every 50 years is going to sort of revert back, you will maybe manage the land differently. Maybe a tribe will be less assertive in buying up large groups of land because they know that it will be reverted eventually. It's a regular reminder that the land was not ultimately theirs, the land was God's. And God knew that this was a possibility, that the longer that they were in a particular place, the more successful they became, the more land they acquired, the easier it would be for them to forget God and to look over everything they had built. So in Deuteronomy 8, we see this warning. God gives a warning that once the people have settled, once the people have plowed and planted, once the people have reaped what they've sown, they've built their homes, they've built their families, they've built their neighborhoods, they will very easily forget God. They will very easily look around and say, man, look at what I built with my very hands. And they will forget God as the source of all of it. That's the warning. And so this Jubilee year was that very reminder, that regular reminder to hold on to land and property very lightly. To hold on to all that they have built lightly, because God is the source. Ultimately, it all belongs to God. Now, I look at this Jubilee, and it seems like a fascinating notion for how to manage the land that God had given the people at that time. I'm curious if it's directly applicable to our context today. The short answer is probably no, but I don't want to just throw away the idea without really wrestling with it. There are practical ways that people have seen this notion of Jubilee as an invitation for them to respond in faithful ways. In this country, it is well documented that land was regularly stolen from native peoples who called this place home. So some individuals and families and organizations have actually given land back to the native tribes that were here before European settlement. Some have given the proceeds of the land sale to those original tribes. There's some who have practiced offering verbal and written land acknowledgments, where they name the tribes, the original peoples that were on a particular land, and they essentially promise to do better than we used to do in terms of being respectful and honoring the rights of the people who were here before us. Other individuals or families or organizations have actually chosen to begin paying rent on the land that they technically and legally own outright, paying rent to the original peoples that occupied it. Now, these examples probably don't seem like reasonable responses based on our current standards of legal property ownership. But I believe that we might consider them faithful responses to God's understanding of Jubilee. If any of this rings a bell in your mind or your heart, I'd be more than happy to talk with you further to consider how might any of these ideas be possibilities for the future for our church or for individuals or families. But whether or not we choose these particular types of actions which address the past, there will always be discernment needed for the future. And if we're to absorb the faithful posture that God is the true owner of all the earth, then our decisions about buying or selling or even using our land, our property, will be affected. So will we be tight-fisted with what is ours or open-handed with what ultimately belongs to God? I had a high school teacher who I think demonstrated this open-handedness with their family vehicle. They had a simple two-door car in which the keys were always in the ignition. And we all knew that the keys were always in the ignition in the parking lot of the school. And I think at their house, too. And he was very clear about sharing whenever he had the opportunity, in case someone was hearing who needed it. His posture was, if someone needs this car more than I do, then I shouldn't stand in their way. It's not ultimately mine. Now, I don't remember ever seeing that car being taken by someone else, possibly because it was like a 1982 Ford Fiesta or something like that, that didn't seem like the kind of car that people would necessarily want to take. So maybe there was a little safety in his posture. But still, it was very clear, this is not ultimately my car. If someone needs it more than I do, they should take it. The keys are in the ignition. And he was serious. I don't think it was a stunt. He knew that he had been given the gift of the resources he needed to acquire things like his car. And because he saw it as a gift from God, not something that was his for the taking, he held the property itself very loosely, with an open hand, with, I would say, hospitality. So when I think about hospitality, I usually think of the very structured and controlled way in which we practice it in our home. We plan ahead of time to invite someone to our house for a meal. We do our best to avoid food allergies, and we make people feel comfortable. We even say things like, make yourself at home, although there's probably unnamed limits to that sentiment. I think I might be a little annoyed if someone just ran over to the snack closet and grabbed some pretzels and plopped down on the couch and turned the TV on. But we have it well structured and well within our control whenever we have someone over to our house. But the biblical framework of God being the true owner of all these things, I hope, pushes us out of this comfort zone as we consider what hospitality looks like. I've given some examples for what this could look like, but I ultimately don't have clear answers to these questions of how this perspective of God's hospitality might shape or change our very lives. So I hope that we will process these ideas in our households, in our faith communities, in our small groups, in places where we can figure out in our context of our family or our neighborhood or our small group or our church, whatever it is, that we would be able to take the time to figure out how and why these things might affect our daily lives and our daily decisions. But these are the questions that we are left with. If God is the host, how are we doing at being good guests in this good world? How do we reclaim the reality that everything belongs to God while living in the midst of a culture that has established firm and clear rules and practices for owning land? When we are hosts, how can we offer more radical hospitality, recognizing that our things and our space is not ultimately ours, but it all belongs to God? My hope is that as we take the time to pray about these things and discern these things and practice these things, that we will recognize how much we have received in this marvelous gift of hospitality from God, this awesome house that we have been invited into, that we see all around us every day. Can we embody that generosity that God has given to us and reflect it out to all those around us? I believe that hospitality based on God's model of hospitality will not simply end with a nice meal with good company, but in people actually experiencing the very self-giving nature of God through us. That's hospitality. May it be so.